Hello, everyone. It's Michael Charles here. I just see that people are still trickling in to the presentation, so I'm going to start in about 30 seconds, but we'll just wait a few more seconds for people to fill in the room. Okay, I see that the sort of the numbers are plateauing for the moment at around 100. That sounds like a good place to start. I just have a couple of introductory remarks to make, and so hopefully people will still be able to trickle into the room before the main event starts. But welcome everyone. This is such a wonderful occasion here under very challenging circumstances, but such a critical conversation to have. I want to thank especially President Benoit Antoine Bacon and other distinguished guests for joining us. Thank all of you for taking the time out of your evening to be a part of this conversation facilitated by Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, or NIPSIA, entitled We Rise Together, Stopping Anti-Asian Racism. I'm Michael Charles, and I am the Assistant Vice President and University Advisor, Equity and Inclusive Communities, and I have the privilege of welcoming you and introducing this evening's discussion. To begin in a good way, we first acknowledge Carleton's location on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples as a reminder of our obligation to reconcile with the indigenous peoples of this land. And for me, that ever deepening understanding and practice of reconciliation can provide insights into other social justice concerns, including tonight's focus on racism, as currently experienced by many members of the Asian diaspora in Canada. So like Indigenous peoples who righteously advocate with the state in respect of the land, history, and culture, so too is the narrative between Canada and many Asian diasporic communities complicated through history, land, and the search for belonging. And to be sure, those relationships with the state are different, but there are instructive points of resonance when you bring these two struggles together. So acknowledging the responsibility for reconciliation and its intersections with human rights, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a good place to begin when thinking about tonight's subject. So once again, welcome. When Professor Yanling Wang approached me to collaborate and support her concept for this forum, I saw it as a great opportunity for a couple of reasons. One, the idea of Professor Wang leveraging her stature as a thought leader in the field of economics, international trade, and foreign direct investment into the social justice sphere would mark the event with a kind of a credibility and an interdisciplinary appeal that I thought would work well. But secondly, I also thought the invitation was really attractive because it offered me the chance to demonstrate allyship, that as a member of the African diaspora, I might visibly represent the call to arms found in tonight's title, We Rise Together. So this is a tremendous honor, and I thank you, Yanling, and look forward to your moderation of this important conversation with the panelists tonight. The Honorable Senator Yun Pa Wu, Daniel Kwan Watson, Felice Chin, and Professor Xiaobei Chen. Tonight's subject should disturb all of us, Asian and non-Asian, not just in the fact of the rise of hate since the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, but in what that rise might say about both perpetrators and the rest of us who make up the non-Asian population in Canada. For the perpetrators, it's tempting to link comments from poor leaders like those of the former American president, and even some from those on the right side of the legitimate political spectrum in Canada, with the rise of anti-Asian hate. We might point to those instigators and accuse that but for your defamatory and demonizing efforts to racialize a virus, the harms of the last many months would have been substantially reduced. So in this view, we consider mass moral failings as the product of charismatic leadership. But I worry that a but-for perspective sets up perpetrators of anti-Asian hate as the vulnerable good, those who would not have committed impugned acts without the manipulative expertise of those with official power and influence. In this construct, those folks are impressionable or even otherwise oppressed and are triggered by the almost hypnotic suggestion of the nefarious. And while this is a charitable perspective, I'm not sure that reflects the complexity of the way we humans come to think about those we consider not in our group. And psychologists and neuroscientists have established a large body of literature showing how bias and stereotype get ingrained from the cradle to the grave through social, educational, legal, political, and economic dynamics and systems. And these dynamics and systems embed in unconscious and conscious fear, threat, and prejudice just below the skin's surface, waiting to be expressed in times of stress. So racist acts are therefore not created by verbal triggers, they are merely justified by them. And the but-for argument only serves to relieve the perpetrators of a deeper individual responsibility. Now, I also mentioned I'm also disturbed by what this moment means for we non-Asians who have not engaged in impugned behavior. To say that attention to anti-Asian hate obtained appropriate focus only after the March 16th Atlanta, Georgia killings is a fair comment. The headline-bearing stories filled with floods of data about harassment, assaults, people being spit on, stories of vandalism, largely found validation after those 8 people, including 6 women, were murdered. And whatever the motives of the assailant, did we really not see this coming? Did we not notice the accumulating pain all this time? Is it only through the sufficiency of death that we stand up against widening alienation? Is it only by massacres at mosques, temples, polytechnics, and knees on necks that we are wrenched from our state of denial? Now, as someone whose role it is to think about institutional change to enhance respect for human rights and promote the power of EDI, I want to use this as a moment of introspection, even as I work to stop the unacceptable behaviors of others. So hopefully with some humility, I want to turn this over now to Professor Wang and the panel to lead us through this reflection and teaching. So over to you, Yanling.
Michael, thank you so much for that powerful introduction. In 2002, the Canadian government officially declared May as Asian Heritage Month. This is a time to reflect on and celebrate the contributions that Canadians of Asian descent have made and continue to make to the prosperity of Canada. From over 100 years ago, building the Pacific Railways, to today's frontline health workers fighting COVID pandemic. Asian Canadians have been active in every industry and every part of Canada. So simply put, they have been the integral part of the Canadian fabric, enriching the lives for Canadians of any racial background. However, behind their hard work and the achievements lies the many unique challenges they have been facing. related with their race. Different times witnessed different difficulties, but one thing is common. They face racial hate and discrimination. The pandemic had brought to daylight racism many Asian Canadians have been suffering. So many news reports have made it clear that members of the Asian diaspora have been subject to increasing blame, stigma, verbal and physical attacks. Behind each incident is a human victim inflicting a family and a community. Some have suffered physical wounds, but so many have suffered mentally and psychologically, which will impact their long-term health. Still, so many live in fear. For them, in addition to the COVID pandemic, they also face the shadow pandemic of hate and discrimination. So really, the question is no longer if racism is real, but rather what we can do to remedy it. Canada is celebrated as a beacon of democracy in its multiculturalism, inclusiveness, and diversity. To truly celebrate Asian Canadians' heritage, culture, and contribution, we need to address the racist attacks they face. And more importantly, we need to discuss ways to stop these attacks. I have confidence that Canada can do better. When we face problems, we ask ourselves questions. See, as an individual, what should each one of us do to tackle everyday racism? As a country, what could we do better to ensure that every Canadian, regardless of their racial background, will feel embraced and celebrated? We are so fortunate today to have 4 distinguished speakers with us for this conversation. And I would just skip their achievements. If I do focus on their achievements, we're going to take half an hour. So, Mr. Daniel Kwong Watson, Deputy Minister at Government of Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. Ms. Phyllis Chin, Executive Director of News at CBC Ottawa. The Honorable Yuen Paul Wu, Independent Senator representing British Columbia. And Dr. Xiaobei Chen, Professor here at Carleton University. Before I turn the mic to our speakers, I would like to remind our listeners that please send in your questions through the Q&A function. We will have a question and answer period at the end. So I would like to start with you, Deputy Minister Kwong Watson. I myself read your personal response to journalist Rex Murphy's question on whether Canada is a racist country. I must confess that I was so deeply touched, moved, encouraged by your resilience, wisdom, and attitude. In the context of your personal story, and with the increasing anti-Asian racist attacks, would you please share with our audience your insights and thoughts on what should be done to stop this racist attacks on Asians and also to be kind to each other? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with so many excellent panelists. I'd have signed up to hear this if I hadn't been on the panel itself. That's wonderful these panelists are. I did write that story, and at first I wrote it for myself. I was quite frustrated that the question was even asked about whether or not racism existed in Canada. And I know that I'm not special. In that there are many hundreds of thousands or even millions of other Canadians who have experienced racism and who have lived stories similar to mine, in some cases much worse than mine, but in no cases where you've experienced racism is it good. And I thought that it would be important to share that. I wrote it therapeutically at first, just for myself, but after I shared it with a number of people, they said that they had strong reactions to it as well. And so I decided to let it go out into the world, and it found its way many different places. I wanted to have two things happen when the letter went out. And for one group, I wanted to make it easier for people to tell their truths and their stories. It's not an easy thing to tell that story. I'd never written down anything like that in my life before. There are people who say, well, people just like to tell these stories for some advantage that they can gain. And quite frankly, I've never figured out what that logic was. At no point in time in telling those stories was it anything that ever helped me get something at all. What usually happened is people would say you're a liar, or they would say you're exaggerating, or they would say that you just didn't understand things properly. At no point in time, really, did any significant number of voices ever say in the past, when I would tell one of those stories, that, listen, this is a real problem, and we really need to go forward and change this. At best, you'd sometimes have people say, oh, yeah, that's pretty messy. But to have people tell those stories, I think, is important. Because as much as we're talking about the last 14 months and the statistics, for example, in Vancouver, where there's over an 800% increase in reported racist attacks against Asian people, we're not trying to go back to the world that existed on January the 1st, 2020, because there was an awful lot of racism that people were experiencing on January 1st, 2020 as well. And I think as we have these conversations, we need to make sure that it's not just the cell phone videos in grocery stores that stop. It's not just the attacks on aged people trying to buy milk in corner stores that we're trying to stop. It's not just the cell phone videos of somebody driving their children to school or to a park that gets stopped and assaulted. That's not just what we're trying to stop. What we're trying to stop is a whole long list of daily events that far too many people experience in this country and have for far too long. I have a copy of my biological grandfather's head tax certificate. It's signed by a federal public servant whose title was the Director of Chinese Immigration. Actually, it was the Controller of Chinese immigration was the title, because of course Chinese immigration in that day was something to be controlled because it was dangerous and it was bad. And so we have these histories, we have these experiences that people have lived. And I think in part of what we need to do is to talk about it. And I've said to many people who have said it was courageous to write it, it wasn't really courageous, I was just really frustrated. But what I've said to people who have said it was courageous, I said, no, if you've lived it, you've already lived the hardest part of it. It's way harder to live these things than it is to write about them. And, you know, there are many scientists, I suspect, listening in, and rationalists, and you'll be certain that alchemy doesn't exist. It was a wonderful thought of magic way back when. But the alchemy of telling these stories is this. They were done and shared out of ignorance as acts. They were done out of malice. They were done out of evil. But by sharing them, we can actually turn them into a healthy and positive conversation. And I'm tickled pink with that particular alchemy, where I've taken things that people did to me out of malice and out of intent to injure, and I put it in a place where, because of the conversations we're having, it's actually achieving some good. The second side of what I wanted to do was make these experiences less invisible. And the fact is that many people, of all the comments I've got, roughly 80% say some version of the fact that my experience is similar to their own in some ways, at least. Sometimes mine is much more volume and maybe more violent in some respects. Other times people have told me stories where their experiences were much more painful, much more long lasting, and much less resolution to some of them. But having said that, the other 20% have responded to me that they never really knew that these things happened in Canada. It was a surprise to them. And I think this is the space for changing these behaviors. Canada has proven that it can solve almost any problem that it can identify. We haven't been perfect, but we have taken on some extraordinary challenges in our history. And I'm convinced that we can take this one on and do it well as well. But the first step is to actually understand what we're dealing with and understand what the challenge is. And that's what I hope that this did. And I think it is one part of going forward. I take no credit in my story in saying that. What I am saying is that as we all speak up, as we all listen, as we all look for a shared way forward, we can yet again get Canada to live up to the values that it's rightly proud of. But part of being proud of those values is to recognize when we've fallen short and where there's something we need to change that. And I hope that that's part of what these conversations do.
Thank you so much. After your English version and the article was translated in Chinese within a very short time period in the Chinese community, over 1,000 people have read it, and they actually told me they felt like so many things have happened to them, but somehow you put it so beautifully together and it struck the chord of so many. Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. I would go with Professor Chen, since she's a sociologist, and also she has been quite vocal in addressing the rising anti-Asian hate. I mean, Professor Chen, would you please walk us through why you think it is happening? And also, what are the effects you mean to educate the public so that they can simply realize that racism is wrong?
Thank you, Yanling. Thank you so much for you and Michael for inviting me, and it's really my honor to be part of this very special panel. So I want to begin by saying that there are multiple reasons that have worked together to shape the resurgence of anti-Asian racism. Because of time constraint, I'm going to highlight two main ones. The first is that racism against the Asians needs to be traced back to European imperialist attacks and the semi-colonization of China. And also there are other invasions and interventions in the Asia Pacific, in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and so on, Vietnam. Through those interactions, the ideology that constructs Asians, specifically East Asians, as a race, and one that is biologically and culturally different in fundamental ways from the white race and other race, it's through those interactions that this idea came about. So I think we need to recognize that, and we need to understand it's deeply rooted. In North America, in the context of settler colonialism, what we have is a history of Asian immigrants being constructed as threats to the biological reproduction of the white nation. So many legislations were passed by the parliament to ban, to exclude, and to marginalize Asians. The laws are not in effect anymore, but the idea of Asians being perpetual foreigners still is. And that's part of the reason why we are seeing this resurgence of anti-Asian racism. And the other main reason is geopolitics. Anti-Asian racism, like other anti-immigrant racisms, is always tied up with shifts in global geopolitics. We are seeing the rise of China as an economic superpower. We are seeing it's rising as an authoritarianism that's explicitly against the liberal democracy, with its own ambitions that do not align with the dominating power. So this has caused a great deal of anxiety and fear about China. Some of these are, of course, understandable and normal emotional reactions in the realm of competition, but some have been fanned up by certain politicians and conspiracy theory propaganda outlets for their own political and economic interests. So in such social and political contexts, China, the Chinese, or anyone who looks like a Chinese are blamed for the for a whole bunch of things. First, for the origin of the virus, then for the spread of the virus, and even for some of Western governments' errors made in fighting the pandemic. So, like the scapegoating theory, China and the Chinese is a simple and also convenient, culturally sanctioned blame for very complex, difficult problems that Canada and the US and other countries have, with multiple reasons, with diffuse causes. So that's the sort of the macro context for the problems that we are seeing. How to educate the public? I'm going to say that racism exists. It's not because people don't understand that racism hurts. Those people who are overtly racist, the intention is precisely to hurt and to intimidate. And those who peddle hate, their motivation is to shift the blame and or to feel more in control when they identify a scapegoat. Surely there are circumstances when harm is caused by unconscious bias, but at the root of it, racism is a deliberately invented, valorized set of ideas that were used purposely to justify power relations. And these are power relations that go way beyond interpersonal level. So we need to understand racism beyond individual behavior and individual trauma to really understand it. It's about social relations. It's about power relations and a political economy as well. And public education is really important. And the first thing I think is about the invisibility, right? I think both Michael and Daniel spoke to the fact that we have to actually say that, hey, this problem does exist. We spend a lot of time and energy to convince people that this problem is real. That is what's called the invisibility of Asians and the invisibility of anti-Asian racism. Now, to counter that, I think I first want to just say, let's all remember that Asians account for 18% of the population in Canada. That's drastically different from the US. In the US, Asians account for 6% of the population. So keep that in mind. I think it says a lot about, I think in a way, it says to us that the invisibility of Asians is even worse in Canada, given our higher proportion in the population. The second direction I'd like to see that public education around this issue takes is that we need to interrogate racism in all forms. I think it's important not to reinforce an individualist understanding of racism, where racism is reduced to a few bad apples. We need to see and understand the structural roots of anti-Asian racism. For example, immigration policy, multicultural programs, while I'm not saying that they are bad, right? But the way they are formulated in the last several decades, they have structural effects on Asian communities. They structure Asians' position in the labor force, and they also have the effect of depoliticizing Asian communities. So those are structural factors that we need to interrogate as well. And the other is the intersection of race, class, and gender. This is something that in public education, we have to always keep it front and center. One of the reasons for the invisibility of anti-Asian racism is connected to the model minority myth. This myth focuses on the prevailing stereotypes of Asians as hardworking, as independent, as good in math, and economically prosperous. But what it hides is that these stereotypes are actually harmful as well. And that they also hide the complexity within the Asian community. I'll just cite statistics. According to analysis of Canada's 2016 census data, Chinese and Black Canadians both have poverty rate reaching 20%. While Asian Canadians are highly represented in skilled occupations, particularly among those born in Canada, there's also high poverty. The high poverty rates of Asian Canadians also suggest that they are also overrepresented in low-paying occupations, particularly among immigrants. So, and related to that, we also have the feminization of poverty, violence, and exploitation that many working class Asian women face due to the precarious immigration status, gender stereotyping, and the fetishization of Asian women's bodies. So I think especially as we come together to talk about these issues, it's important to make sure that the different experiences are understood, are reflected and understood, and the different vulnerabilities are addressed. So, and the fourth aspect in public education is decolonization and the broader anti-racism. The fact that when we talk about anti-Asian racism, we need to specifically locate these discussions in the context of widespread protests against the anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racisms. And otherwise, we will not go very much ahead.
Thank you so much. It's indeed quite helpful walking us through the history and the sociology. And I'm sure it's going to be very productive and also constructive for our listeners to take that into heart. Okay, so Senator Wu, I would like to go with you. And you have been independent senator since 2016. It is indeed a very privileged position. And yourself are an expert in international economics and foreign relations. You know, last month you accepted my invitation to come to NIPSIA to give a talk to address the Canada-China relations at this very difficult time. Unfortunately, many people attacked you personally after that talk. As a Chinese Canadian, immediately went to your identity rather than engaging with you intellectually. Unfortunately, I don't think your situation is unique. So my question to you, one, what is the impact on you personally? I know you're a strong person, but still, I need to ask that question. And secondly, what do you think? I mean, why do you think people have that attitude? And what does that say about their mindset? And lastly, very important, what should be and could be done for a real change?
Thank you, Yanling, and thank you to Carleton and Professor Charles and others who organized this event. It's I'm really learning a lot, and I almost want to just spend the time thinking about what has been said already rather than offering my views. But you've asked me a question, and how does it affect me? Well, you know, of course it affects me, and I just had another barrage today of attacks, really personal attacks around why my views essentially should be censored, you know, because some people don't like my views. I think I'm more concerned about the many other Chinese Canadians and other people who speak on issues related to China, who don't have the protections and the status and the privilege that I have as a senator. I am, of course, relatively protected. And I have the liberty of saying things without fear of, you know, serious repercussions. But not so many other scholars like yourselves, people in the media, people working in NGOs, and just folks who have ordinary jobs. For them to say something or to take a position that is even remotely aligned to what Beijing might be saying, for example, is to run a great risk of being stigmatized. And, you know, I saw this just a few weeks ago with one of your colleagues, the head of the Confucius Institute, who was testifying at a parliamentary hearing, where he was subjected to a really horrendous line of questioning. And because they didn't like his answer, or because he didn't give the answer that they wanted him to give, he has been vilified in social media. in ways that are really unthinkable and which are not becoming of Canadian society. But let me just back up a bit to say that while Canada-China relations clearly has an impact on the spike in anti-Asian racism, there is also a broader context for this hate that has been aided and abetted, unfortunately, by the political class, by the media, by commentators over the last few years. And this has been particularly pronounced in Vancouver, which I'm sorry to tell you, Bloomberg has just declared to be the anti-Asian hate capital of North America. Just think about that. An international publication has just pronounced to the world that Vancouver is the anti-Asian hate capital of North America. Well, maybe it's not true, but even to have that thought is repulsive. But why? This is the question that nobody really is asking. I really appreciate Professor Chen's analysis, but let me try and get to some of the more proximate issues that I think account for the spike in anti-Asian racism in the last 18 months or so. It is that in the last, I would say, half a dozen years, there has been a false narrative around the role of Chinese people, quote unquote foreigners, in buying up real estate in Vancouver and making housing unaffordable for locals. Furthermore, the insinuation is that the money used to buy property in Vancouver was dirty money to start with. And so they single-handedly turned Vancouver into the money laundering capital of North America. And what's worse, the dirty money came from the trafficking of fentanyl, which also killed thousands of people on the streets of our city. You throw that concatenation of half-truths and lies and false narratives together, and you get a very potent, very toxic mix of sentiments in the general consciousness that was waiting to be unleashed on Asian Canadians when COVID then overlaid all of this. I believe that's what has happened in the last 18 months. And the problem is that if we don't try to actually identify what has caused the spike in anti-Asian racism recently, we're not going to get far in solving the problem. And very few people have been willing to have this conversation, partly because there are many people implicated in perpetuating, in propagating, in starting those false narratives. Back to you, Yanling.
Thank you so much. And indeed, you talk about a very important question about the public narrative. Then that question is going to be going to Ms. Chin. And since you work in the media, as it is very clear from history and from present, media has a megaphone really in shaping the narratives, public opinion, and policy directions. And based on the previous three panelists have said, and also based on the increasing anti-Asian racist attacks, from your perspective and your experience in the media, here's a question to you. How and what the media can do better in making Canada a more inclusive and a better place for everyone?
Thank you. Let me start by saying I represent all media out there. No, not at all. Of course, media is not one entity. It's not a monolith. It's a ton of private and public companies, individuals, and choices that are made. And collectively, they may or may not tell a story. So what can the media do to make Canada more inclusive? It is to do its job, which is to accurately reflect modern, contemporary Canada. And what does that mean? That means normalizing Asians in the media. So whether that's on television, in web stories, in news, or even in sitcoms, what are the faces that you see on TV? You know, Professor Chen mentioned that Asians make up something like 18% of the population. Are 18% of the voices out there those of Asians? I highly doubt that. In fact, I know it's not the case because the newsrooms I've worked for have tracked who gets a microphone. And I can tell you for sure that Asians don't make up 18%. And even within that small sliver where Asian voices are heard, what are they talking about? How are they portrayed? What accents do you hear? You know, I know that this is an area of great concern for a lot of Asians, and people are very self-conscious about it, and we internalize that racism. I know I did as a teenager. You know, I worked very hard on my accent. I moved to Canada when I was 16. So who are the voices? Who are the people representing Asians on television and in media? And what are the stories we're telling? And that's not to say we bury the truth. You know, there are people, there are fentanyl traffickers, there are people who are inflating prices of housing, but those can't be the only stories we tell, because if those are the only stories we tell, then that dominates the narrative, that dominates what's being said about us, right? Elsewhere, outside the news, whenever you see an Asian person on television, is that person a restaurant owner, a karate master, maybe like a bookworm? Or do we have other, like a wide array of people of representation? So here I'm talking about representation, right? This is why it's so important. This is why when Kim's Convenience came out, it was widely celebrated because it offered a different portrayal of Asians typically we see on television. And then I want to talk about just the media's own definition of racism. You know, we see lots of headlines of people being yelled at, slurs, that sort of thing. And over time, I think people have a sense, it shapes people's reality of what racism is. And yes, those are very overt acts of racism, very concrete examples of racism, but it doesn't address the systemic racism that exists in Canada. And that is any action or any thought that you have that perpetuates any sort of inequality based on race is racism. So I want to just highlight that point, that it's not, so yes, when we were talking about the media, for example, is the media racist? Are journalists all racist? Are all the showrunners of every television show racist? Maybe not. They might not even admit that. But do their individual actions contribute to an overall narrative that is racist? Do their tiny little biases, you know, is the only time you ever talk about Chinese people in the news is to talk about a new restaurant or talk about, you know, real estate prices? That all contributes to this building of inequality, this building of a certain narrative that's there. And it all comes from small little choices, no different than small little choices that we all do outside the media. And so, I do want to highlight that. And then finally, a very important point, not just for the media, but anyone who's in government or in places of power, is to quantify racism. You know, we can't fix what we don't measure. And the problem with that is we often don't measure what we don't think are problems. Does that make sense? It's this infinite loop of like self-perpetuating problem where people say, well, there's no point in measuring it because it's not a problem. And then the same argument goes, there is no problem because the data doesn't say that. So in the media, for example, within, you know, my small sphere of influence, I do track what types of stories we do. I put a number on it. And that's not to create token stories or to create an artificial, you know, like we must hit this number, but to actually tell ourselves, what is the long-term story we're telling about Canadians? When I look at the aggregate from the last year, for example, of any particular show, I can actually put a number on, you know, what types of stories we're telling. And I don't just do this on race, but also the subjects we're talking about. So we do need to quantify these things and actually take an almost academic lens to see the problem.
Thank you so much. And people say numbers speak, and the data you collected will tell the story, really. I have already collected quite many questions. And the first question here is it is actually directed by the listener to our Deputy Minister. And this is a question. Do you think that now, with the public statements of politicians, businessmen, and senior officials, Asian Canadians have more allies in society when it comes to opposing violence, discrimination, and racism? What more can be done today to bring attention to anti-Asian sentiment and violence in our Canadian communities?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I want to extend this panel about another 18 hours so I can keep listening to the other three, and I'll just be quiet and listen. It's wonderful to hear what you've all had to say. I know, just in the interest of time, I don't want to take too long on this, but I think one thing has changed for good. It's a sad thing, and it was raised in Yanling's, in your comments at the beginning. There's a lot of cell phone video, and there's enough cell phone video that nobody can ever go back to the world where they say this wasn't real. And I think once something becomes real, what you can do with it is different. And I don't see ever getting back to a point where many of us have to explain in the same way that we have had to do for a long period of time, say this is real. I don't know how many of you remember the early days of Sesame Street, but there was a character on Sesame Street called Snuffleupagus. And in the early days of Snuffleupagus, the only characters that saw that magical elephant-like creature were the children. Because every time Snuffleupagus would appear, the adults would be doing something else. And then the adults returned, Snuffleupagus would disappear, and all the children would talk about Snuffleupagus. And the adults would all say, what are you talking about? We never saw it. And racism is a little bit like Snuffleupagus, in that far too many people believe, often sincerely, that they've never seen it, so it can't possibly exist. And I think we've crossed that barrier. So does that solve things? No, but I think it gives a different platform. But I also think too, that many millions of Canadians have looked at that, have been horrified at that, and said, this cannot be a part of the future of my country, and that needs to change. And so Alice, for example, is talking about the assessment that we need to do in the world of the media. And Yuan Wu is talking about the many different conversations that we've had. The housing price one, you know, I think anybody who has Chinese ancestry in Canada winces when the conversation of housing prices comes up, because you know it's just a matter of time until you're pointed at, and then maybe somebody else says, well, not you, you're too poor. But at the same time, you know they really mean you if you're walking down the street. And these are the types of things I think we have a different platform to address now. And I don't think we can go back from that.
Thank you so much. Senator Wu, there's a question from the audience directed to you. Here's a question. For discrimination against people of Chinese heritage in particular, how much of the political tension between China and Canada do you think contributed to reinforcement of that prejudice? Is there a way to effectively educate the public to separate the cultural part from the political part?
To answer the first part of the question, resounding yes. The very difficult relationship that we have with China currently is affecting public opinion on China and is being weaponized by some who see it as a reflection of Chinese people in general. This is a very uncomfortable thing to say, because there are lots of Chinese people who are anti-People's Republic of China, many of my Hong Kong friends and Taiwanese friends, but they are victims all the same. So there's no question that the Canada-China relationship and the way in which China has treated two of our compatriots, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, has caused great outrage. Most of it directed in a very appropriate way, but for others, it has been an excuse for racist hate. I think one of the solutions has to be that the way in which we talk about relations with China has to change, and the way in which our leaders describe the challenges in the relationship has to be less typecasting, if I can put it that way. And I start from Parliament Hill, where a lot of the discussion is based on very crude binaries, essentially putting people into boxes where they are either patriotic Canadians or they are treasonous CCP sympathizers. There's no ground in between. And worse, the political class and the media and others are setting up all kinds of litmus tests to determine whether Yunpao Wu is in one box or the other. So if I carry a Huawei phone, I'm suspect. If I have WeChat, boy, let's take a close look at him. If I hold a view that is remotely aligned with what Beijing might be saying, that's probably grounds to deport him from the country. And these are all real examples that I'm getting on social media and elsewhere. They're all wrong. All of that is wrong. What happened to your colleague from the Confucius Institute? That's wrong. And unless we call out these abhorrent behaviors and sloppy thinking, frankly, just sloppy thinking, we're not going to get very far. And this is not only going to affect and hurt the Canada-China relationship, which is a whole separate topic, it's going to hurt Chinese people in Canada, regardless of their views on the PRC.
Thank you so very much. It's indeed a very complicated question. Here's a question for Ms. Chin. Do you think the youth today are doing a good job in supporting the fight against racism?
I think the news is going through a reckoning, much like a lot of other institutions. I know newsrooms across North America are going through a big change, reviewing its own policies and biases, looking at its leadership roles, who are the people making choices. I know within my own newsroom, we are thinking oftentimes, any story we try to think about, who's the missing voice in this piece that's relevant, and that will help. Are we doing a very good job? I don't think so. I think we're in a period of change, and certainly the Black Lives Matter movement has really propelled it forward. I know for a fact that all mainstream media, I can't speak for some of the more fringe ones, but at least the mainstream ones, they've known this for a long time, that there's a gap in a lot of the coverage, we're only as good as who actually watches us and listens to us and reads us, right? And who are the ones doing that? They are Canadians, and Canadians are a diverse bunch. So we must reflect this diversity. And so I know there is a conscious effort in all the mainstream media newsrooms to do a better job. And we are trying better every day.
Thank you so very much. And the clock really tickles, and we are only a few minutes away from the 6:30. So now I'm going to ask a question to all of the panelists.
Yan-Ling, can I actually just add to what
Oh, sure, of course.
Elise said earlier, which is about how to address the problem, about the tension between China and Canada, and how that has become a fertile ground, right, for hostility against the Asians. I think one thing here is the dehumanized way of thinking about Chinese people, that we are really sort of just as virus or as unthinking agents who would robotically somehow follow the command of the Chinese communist government and do their wishes. This is something that I wrote about as early as in 2008, when Beijing hosted the Olympics, and when some of the Chinese diaspora were supportive of Beijing hosting the Olympics, and how that was reported and represented in Canadian media. And it was, I think that prejudice is this binary understanding of Chinese people can only be pro the Chinese communist government or against. It really denies the majority of us are either, right? And we have very complex life experiences, and more recent immigrants from mainland China. Many of us have suffered a lot in the last several decades in China, but at the same time, we also know, we go to China often, we know what's going on in China. We see the elevation of poverty is real. We see the building of high-speed train networks and real. We know that the people's lives, my family's lives, everyone's lives has improved. Like those things you cannot deny, right? But what we are, it seems to be that to prove that we are loyal to Canada, we have to always take an anti-China position. That's the prejudice that has a very strong hold in Canadian society. I think all institutions should really pay attention to that. And
thank you. Sorry.
That we can track, right? It's not something we can see. A lot of times that kind of the effect of that prejudice will be subtle, will be elusive, but it's going to affect the life chances of Chinese people.
Thank you so much, Shelby. It really took a sociologist to nail it. The time is really short. You know what? I still want to give every panelist a final chance. So here is a question. I'm seeking a one-sentence answer. One sentence answer from every panelist. I mean, the community is hurt, the community is fearful. If there's one sentence you want to convey to the Asian Canadian community, what is it? So I will start with you, Deputy Minister.
I would say, tell your story and be confident in it, and do not be defined by other people's actions.
Thank you. Senator?
You belong to Canada. You are part of Canada's DNA, and you should celebrate it and flaunt it. Don't be ashamed of it.
Ms. Chin?
I would say that we are all individuals. Don't get us all mixed up together.
And my sociologist colleague, Shelby?
I would say that recognize and be proud of the complexity in our lives, in our life experiences, and in our positionalities, and really take it seriously to think about how we are becoming Chinese Canadians. I'm writing about that. That's probably why.
Yeah. Thank you so very much. Michael, back to you.
Hi, okay, so I hope that my computer stays on. I'm really quickly running out of power here and it's not recharging. So let me just say thank you so much to our panelists and to you, Yanling, for a really thoughtful conversation, a timely conversation. I know that this is the first of many that are starting to ripple across the country. As we start to think more intentionally about this subject, I think we can begin to incorporate the kinds of remedies and recommendations that have been prescribed. I really like the thoughts around, of course, racism as an instrument in geopolitical struggles, particularly those between Canada and China, and how stereotypes are used to rationalize the irrational and to rationalize the generalization as reinforced by underrepresentation, both in the media and overrepresentation in poverty. So we've begun to frame the issue and to think about possible ways forward. And I look forward to future opportunities and to further collaboration. So thank you to everyone this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, the panelists. And I'm really grateful that you took the time and you came here to share your thoughts and it's really to address the community. It is very much needed conversation. I hope in the future and we could work together again. Thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.